You all know that there is a version of human history in which two people make out and kick everyone else off the planet. Adam and Eve were the star-struck lovers. They lived together in the Garden of Eden. We don't know for sure what they ate in the garden to stay alive, but it was probably more than just the forbidden fruit. Aidan and Ellie don't need to worry about food on their lonely planet. The old blue ball wasn't hit by an asteroid or something else just as bad. Everything was wiped out by artificial intelligence that could think ahead. But then it destroyed itself right before the last two people could be killed. For the first few months, Aidan and Ellie didn't think much about starting humanity over again. They spent a lot of time hanging out at the homes of rich people and driving fast cars. After Ellie almost hit a tree while driving one day, she and her boyfriend decided not to take too many risks. There were important things to do, but since they lived in Los Angeles, California, which has a mild climate, they didn't have to worry about a harsh winter. And that there wasn't any electricity. Let's start by saying that, even though the end of the world was sad, these two people had a great chance of making it. They also didn't know each other, which was a plus. That's a good thing, because studies have shown that the death rate for babies is higher when they are born to people who are related. Even if the kids did survive, they are much more likely to be born with some kind of defect. Still, Ellie and Aidan's children might be healthy when they are born. But what about the children of the children? Between 1933 and 1970, scientists looked at the kids whose parents were first cousins or first cousins once removed. Even though first cousins have twice the chance of having a child with a birth defect, the kids born to first-degree parents didn't have great lives. 40% of them had disabilities that were very bad. Because of their disabilities, 14% of them died. We have a great real-life example of this with a man who you might think was trying to make his country bigger. That man was the King of Thailand from 1868 to 1910. His name was Chulalongkorn. He did a lot of good things to make his country more modern, and he was also a very good father. King Mangkut, who had a total of 82 children, Chulalongkorn was one of them. Following in his father's footsteps, Chulalongkorn had a lot of wives, consorts, and concubines, a total of 116 women, to keep the bloodline pure. Back then, some of his partners with whom he had kids were actually his half-sisters. It wasn't clear how bad it was to be related to someone, but the proof was soon in the pudding, so to speak. He had a child with his half-sister named Box in a Jar Neurology Raj, but it died just hours after it was born. He had 8 kids with Stefan van Hanna, who was his half-sister. One of them only lived for 3 days, and most of them died before they were adults, but Hannah lived to be 93. She came from 2 people who were related. If you look into what happened to his 77 children, you'll find that many of them didn't live very long at all. A lot of them died before they were even old enough to get out of their fancy baby clothes. Many others died in their 20s and 30s. European royalty also liked to keep things in the family to make sure the bloodline was pure and to make sure money and property stayed in the family. When someone died, the children of the royal families in Europe, and the Spanish Habsburg dynasty were often weak and sickly because of this. There was also a defect called the Habsburg jaw, which is now well known. Even though Aidan and Ellie's brave new world didn't have internet, they did have access to books and libraries. Being the smart people they were, they read up on inbreeding, and after reading a few books about it, they were right to be scared. Their children would die as soon as they let out that first primal scream, or they might spend their short lives limping around while doing work that would make desperate Dan look bad. The couple also read about the Colt family in Australia and June and Jim's marriage. In short, June was the child of a brother and a sister. Jim Colt was her husband. When they had their own 7 kids and moved to Australia, they were living in New Zealand. Once, there were more babies, and those babies got old enough to have babies of their own, but the colts didn't go far from home. The children were born as a result of incest. Many of the children were born with birth defects, and some of them seemed a bit crazy and did things like herd animals. Many of the children were also very sick and prone to disease. The family wasn't getting along so well with each other. When a detective found them, he said, "I've never seen anything like it." Aidan and Ellie both got chills when they heard the story. They had been sitting in the library for a while, thinking about a group of kids running around with fungal feet trying to set cows on fire. But did it have to turn out like that? Today, that's the big question. Some, but not many, of King Chulalongkorn's children with his sisters went on to live pretty normal lives, but it's hard to find kids who live past the age of 40. Aidan and Ellie were now sure that a small gene pool would lead to physically and mentally sick kids in the future, when their own kids started having babies. But what else could they do? They had a boy they named Carl. Then they had a girl they named Asher. Damn. 2 boys, they thought. Then, when Carl and Asher were fighting over toys, Carl killed Asher by accident. Ellie and Aidan had a 3rd son and named him Sebastian. Sebastian was another boy who didn't have much to do. These last 2 adults just kept having kids, until they had as many as Ellie could have had, given how she naturally ages. Most of the kids grew up fine, but the kids' were a whole different story. Before we leave, let's talk about the strange case of the extended family. You've heard of that thing called DNA. Even though it has 23 pairs of chromosomes, each one has hundreds of thousands of genes packed into it. These things determine things about people, like the color of their hair, but some of them are also very bad. Alleles are 2 copies of a gene. Sometimes, every gene has 2 copies. When 2 people have a child together, they give the child 1 pair. There are genes that are dominant and genes that are not. If 1 pair of genes is dominant, you will have a trait from that gene. When it's passed down through recessive genes, it's different because you need both sets of genes to get the trait. The gene for brown eyes, for example, is a dominant gene. If you get that, your eyes will be brown. But blue eyes are different because the gene for blue eyes is recessive. To get blue eyes, you need both recessive genes. In this case, both of your parents didn't give you blue-eyed genes. But if one of your parents had brown eyes, you'll have brown eyes too. It's important to note, though, that not all children get the same DNA. You get 50% of your DNA from both parents, unless they are twins. Now, imagine that the DNA you got from your mom was half a pack of cards. When the next child is born, that pack is shuffled, so that the next child doesn't get the same DNA. But if there were a lot of children and you kept moving them around, some of their genes would start to look like those of other children. The good news is that recessive genes carry a lot of bad traits. This is great because they don't show up very often and you need 2 of them to get a bad trait. But if your parents are related to each other, there is a greater chance that they have a bad gene. In that case, the child might get a pair, which would lead to another thing. A baby's chin looks like an old boot from the start. If everyone in a family comes from the same gene pool, bad genes might end up in the Habsburg Charles at some point, even with all the moving around. It took many generations of inbreeding for the 2nd king of Spain to get his famous chin. In fact, he was born with a lot of problems that made his life a living hell for many years. He died at age 38. Just to show you what could go wrong. Here's what the autopsy says: the size of a peppercorn. His lungs ate away at his intestines, making them rot and die. He had a single testicle that was as black as coal, and his head was full of water. When Ellie read that, she passed out right there because she was thinking about her family's future. The first thing that came to mind was that a grandchild of hers looked like a character from a movie called The Toxic Avenger, which she had seen as a child. But one day, while she was reading another book, something made her feel better. She read the lines. There is a lot of proof that low genetic diversity has short-term effects. But none of these things are certain. There are stories of people who have made amazing trips back from the edge. Anything can happen. You can have a lot of luck when you play cards. Ellie tried to figure out what that meant and came to the conclusion that if she and Aidan knocked out enough kids and those kids knocked out enough kids, then, even though there would be a lot of problems, like cows being burned, some of those children might grow up to be successful, and the future of humanity might be in the bag. Eli's hair turned a shade of grey, and by that time, her husband was a strong farmer. Things didn't seem too bad, but one of her favorite authors would have said that some of her grandchildren's lives were nasty and short. Together, she and Aidan had 10 boys and 18 girls. They had kids with each other because that's how things had to be. Evolution wants us to be drawn to people who are different from us genetically. But for the sake of humanity, they had to learn to live with each other. Ellie was still worried after reading that more inbreeding increases the chance of birth defects, like what happened to the Habsburgs. Ellie could safely match her grandchildren if she knew what genes they all had. So babies didn't come into the world sick, but that wasn't possible. She had reason to be hopeful, though, when she read about the people of a small island called Pinkalot in the Western Pacific. These people lived far from the busy world and were almost wiped out by a typhoon in the 18th century. But only 20 of them made it. They did well after that, even though an obsessive gene caused 1/10 of the island's people to be colorblind many years later. The problem was something called complete achroma. Top CIA was thought to have come from one man, but it didn't show up in the population until the 4th generation, and even then, not everyone got it. Ellie was glad to hear this. She sat there with the book in her hand, thinking about those words while one of her granddaughters cried from a crib nearby. Anything can happen, and anything can happen. She said under her breath in a determined tone, "We're going to get back on our feet," even though she caught a glimpse of one of her less successful creations laughing and throwing an aerosol can into a small fire. There was still a long way to go, and what's called the founder effect was still in full force. This means that there was still a lack of genetic diversity between generations, even though Eli's family all looked pretty much the same. Aidan seemed only interested in taking care of his vegetables and cattle at the time, so she hoped that over time, the animals would change on their own and become more different. He gets so far away. Ellie read more and more. Since she was smart and he was good with his hands, they were a good match in some ways. One day, Ellie told Aidan that there were probably times in history when animals started out as a couple eating together and grew into a whole new group. She looked at him and said, "Rats?" "What?" replied Aidan. She told him that a single pair of rats started a population on an island, and now the rats are doing very well. He then gave her a very familiar look and said, "Don't tell me you read that on one of those printouts from that old website." Cora. Ellie stopped talking and went back to her room to read the printout again, saying, "The starlings in North America came from only 60 people. There are about 100 million of them now, and most of them have almost the same genes." That seemed like good news. But she knew that a small number of people was different from the first two. She looked through her books, but she couldn't find any examples of animals that were down to their last pair and then started breeding again. Ellie died when she was 93, 8 years old, and 92 years old. At her side, all of her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, including one called Chimney, made her moan in pain right before she died. The poor kid had just swallowed some broken glass. But she remembered some words from 2015 that had been written by a scientist. If the whole world were started by just 2 people, you'd have to win the genetic lottery a lot of times. Maybe Ellie and Aidan were lucky. But as Ellie took her last breath, surrounded by all those faces, she couldn't know. Things didn't appear to be that bad. She knew, though, that things could still get worse. She also knew that scientists from a long time ago said it would probably take 98 people who are not related to each other to repopulate a planet. But she was looking at people in Aidan who were related to her. So, could it really happen that these 2 start a new life on Earth? Yes, it could possibly happen. But as those scientists said, it would take a lot of luck. If it did happen thousands of years later, no one would believe the story of Ellie and Aidan, the passionate researcher, and the Cabbage Patch Kid. Scientists don't really know how we evolved in the beginning, but they're sure it didn't start with 2 horny people in the Garden of Eden. They know that a few different kinds of humans from the Homo genus lived in Africa about 2 million years ago. These included Homo habilis, which means handy man, and Homo erectus, which means upright man. And then it took a long time for Homo sapiens to tighten up man. Just kidding. It can be translated as wise man before Homo sapiens, which is the oldest type of human. It was also made by Homo neanderthalensis, Neanderthals, modern humans, and Homo sapiens. So, in short, it wasn't like there was only a small pool of genes when things began. We can't compare Ellie and Aidan's situation to something that happened in the past. All we can do is guess that if 2 people were left alone on the planet, they might be able to make it full again. It's not likely. But after that, Ellie and Aidan at least tried.